Red dust swallowed the trail, curling in the fading light as if the land itself were gasping for air. And there, beneath a weathered gallows of rough-hewn timber, a woman hung by the neck. She was no ordinary woman. Tall as a man and more, her broad shoulders jerked with each fading breath. Long legs scraped weakly against the air, boots kicking up nothing but dust. The rope cut deep into her skin, a cruel purple mark carved by human hands. Her eyes, storm gray and wide, pleaded silently, more desperate than any cry. Jonathan Hale pulled his horse to a stop, reins shaking in his calloused grip. He had seen death before. On the battlefields of Shiloh, Antietam, and Gettysburg, he had watched men fall in heaps, crimson soaking into the soil. But this was not war. This was quiet cruelty. A judgment delivered not by cannon fire, but by rope and silence. The evening wind howled through the broken fence, rattling loose boards, making the noose sway. The dagger at Jonathan's belt seemed to burn against his hip. He could ride on, let the prairie claim her soul, as others surely had. Or he could cut her down and step into a story he already knew would demand blood, faith, and a price he might not be able to pay. Jonathan swung down from the saddle, boots crunching the brittle grass. The land stretched wide and empty around him, horizon aflame with the last fire of the sun. This was the land he had staked everything on. Under the Homestead Act, the government promised that any man willing to work the soil could claim his own piece of the West. Jonathan had signed his name and poured the last of his savings into this tract. A quiet corner of the New Mexico territory, sold cheap by a man named Silas Kane. On paper, it was supposed to be a beginning, a chance to bury the ghosts of war beneath plowed furrows and fresh seed, a cabin, a well, and silence to heal the wounds no surgeon could stitch. Yet what greeted him here was no peace. It was the sight of judgment swinging from a beam of weathered wood. His hand hovered at the dagger. He thought of the silver medal in his saddlebag, tarnished by time, still engraved with the word valor. He thought of the Bible tucked inside his coat, its pages worn thin by nights on campaign, where men cried out to God under cannon fire. His mother's voice whispered in memory, "Never pass by a soul crying for mercy." Jonathan's breath tightened. He stepped forward, shadows long across the yard. The woman's boots scraped one last time against the air, her gasps faint as a dying ember. He reached up, steel flashing in the sunset, and cut the rope. Her body collapsed into his arms, heavy as the burdens he thought he had left behind. The woman hit the ground with a dull thud, red dust spiraling around her like smoke from a dying fire. Jonathan dropped to his knees, sliding a rough hand beneath her head. Her skin was fever-hot, her breath shallow, each gasp broken and jagged. "Hold on," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or himself. He pulled the canteen from his belt, tipped cool water against her cracked lips. A faint moan rose from her throat. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy as stone, before lifting just enough for him to glimpse her eyes, storm gray, filled with panic, pain, and something else. A plea. Her lips trembled. A single name slipped out, fractured and bitter. "Kane! Silas Kane! He sold me!" Jonathan froze, the words striking deeper than any blade. Silas Kane, the same man who had pressed him for quick signatures in the town office, selling this land for less than half what it should have been worth? Jonathan had thought he was walking away with a bargain, a chance at peace. Now he understood. Kane had not sold him a ranch. He had sold him a graveyard secret, a debt tied not in numbers, but in flesh and rope. The woman's eyes rolled back, her body shuddering once before slipping into unconsciousness again. Jonathan pressed his fingers to her neck, a pulse, weak, but there. He ripped a strip from his own shirt, winding it carefully around the deep, angry bruises at her throat. The yard was silent, save for the low groan of the gallows wood swaying in the wind. Jonathan lifted his gaze across the ranch.
broken fence lines, a cabin sagging against time, a well nearly dry. On first glance it looked abandoned, yet here and there he saw signs of life not long gone. Rows of soil half-tilled, straw fresh in the pens, a door painted only weeks past. Someone had lived here.
And someone had meant for her to die here. Jonathan clenched his jaw. He had come west to bury the war. But the war had followed him, not in the crack of muskets or the roar of cannon, but in the quiet cruelty of men like Cain. Men who could put a rope around a woman's neck and walk away as if she were less than human. The wind carried the faint sound of a church bell from far across the prairie, hollow and distant. Jonathan bowed his head. His voice came low, almost a whisper. "Lord, if this is the burden you've set before me, give me the strength to carry it." He bent, slid his arms beneath the woman, and lifted her onto his shoulder. He had carried wounded men off bloody fields before. Now he carried one who had been abandoned to die in silence. The cabin door creaked open at his push. Darkness and the scent of old smoke greeted him. He laid her carefully on a torn mattress in the corner, lit the oil lamp, and sat beside her. His hand lingered on the worn leather cover of the Bible tucked in his coat. Whatever Cain had left behind, Jonathan knew one thing with clarity. The moment he cut that rope, he was no longer a bystander. He was bound to her story now, for better or worse.
If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The cabin walls groaned in the prairie wind, their timbers worn and cracked like old scars. Jonathan lit the oil lamp, its flame throwing pale light over the broken interior. In the corner, the woman lay across a torn mattress, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven rhythm. He had wrapped a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt around her throat. The angry welt of the noose pressed against the bandage, purple and raw, each breath a battle. Jonathan knelt beside her, steadying her head with his hands. At length, her eyelids fluttered. The gray storm of her eyes returned, blinking at the wavering lamp. She parted her lips, and her voice came as a rasp, fragile as dust on the wind. "They call me monster." The word cut through the silence, heavier than a bullet. Jonathan swallowed, shaking his head. "No," he said firmly, his tone carrying the weight of oath. "You are no monster. Tell me your name." Her gaze wavered. A faint sound escaped her throat, the shape of syllables nearly lost. "Mara," she whispered at last, "my mother gave me that name." Jonathan repeated it softly, grounding it in the air, as if by speaking it he carved it into stone. "Mara." She closed her eyes, and for a moment he thought she had slipped away again. But then her lips moved once more, almost without breath. "She used to sing, when I was little, a hymn." Jonathan leaned close, catching the fragments. "The one about grace," Mara murmured. "She said the Lord saves the lost, even the ones no one else wants." Her voice broke. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye and trailed down her dust-streaked cheek. Jonathan's chest tightened. He thought of his own mother, her Bible in hand, her voice steady even when the news of his father's death reached them. He thought of the pages worn thin by years of soldiering, still tucked inside his coat. Now here was this woman, branded as a monster, clinging to the faint echo of her mother's hymn. "You're still here," Jonathan said quietly, almost to himself. "That means you're not forgotten." Mara's lips trembled, but no sound followed. She sank back into the mattress, exhaustion pulling her under once more. Jonathan sat in silence, the lamplight flickering against the battered wood. He had not planned for this. The Homestead Act had promised 40 acres, a chance to plow fields instead of remembering gunfire. He had come seeking rest. Yet the Lord had placed Mara in his path, half dead and abandoned. His jaw clenched. He would not call her monster. He would not let her die nameless. Jonathan reached for the Bible in his coat, laying it on the table beside her. Its cover was worn, corners frayed from years of marching across blood-soaked fields. He opened to the flyleaf, tracing the words written there in his mother's hand. "Do not forsake the least of these." He bowed his head, whispering into the quiet, "Mara, as long as I draw breath, you will be seen." Outside, the prairie wind rattled the boards, but within the cabin, the name lingered. A promise. Mara stirred again before dawn, the lamp having burned low to a thin wick. Jonathan dozed in the chair, Bible resting on his chest, but the sound of her hoarse whisper drew him back to waking. Her gray eyes fixed on him, sharper now, though still clouded by pain. She swallowed hard, every movement dragging against the rope scar on her neck. "You should leave me," she rasped. "You don't know what this place is." Jonathan leaned forward, steady, his voice low. "Then tell me." For a long moment she lay silent, torn between fear and the need to be heard. Finally, her lips parted. "I worked for him," she said, her voice broken. "Silas Cain. Years. I plowed his fields, mended his fences, drove off raiders when they came in the night. I did everything a man could do, and more." Her chest hitched with the memory. "But he never saw me as human. To him, I was just a beast to break and use." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He remembered Cain's slick words at the land office, the way he pushed papers across the table with nervous haste. "Sign quick, Hale. Price like this won't come again." Mara's gaze fell to the floor. Then the collectors came, men with ledgers and guns. Cain owed them more than he could pay, and instead of silver or cattle, he gave them me. The words landed like stones in Jonathan's gut. "He called me monster to their faces," Mara went on, her voice trembling with fury held too long. "Said hanging me would settle the debt. Said it would warn anyone who dared cross him. They dragged me to that frame out there and left me swinging. And Cain walked away." Jonathan rose from the chair, pacing the narrow floorboards. He pressed a hand to the wall, the old wood rough beneath his palm. All at once, the painted door, the half-tilled rows, the fresh straw in the pens, it all made sense. Cain hadn't abandoned the land, he'd abandoned her. He'd staged the ranch as a trap, dressing it just enough to lure a desperate buyer. And Jonathan had stepped into it. He turned back to her, voice low but steady. "He sold this land to me." Her eyes widened, horror flashing. "Then you're caught in it too. His debt, his lies, they'll come for you now." Jonathan sank onto the edge of the bed, head bowed. He had faced cannon fire, musket volleys, the charge of cavalry. But this betrayal, this cruelty, it cut deeper than any war wound. Cain had not only betrayed Mara, he had betrayed the very soil Jonathan had poured his last coin into. Silence pressed heavy in the room, broken only by the faint rattle of the wind. Mara's eyes glistened. "You should walk away, before it swallows you too." Jonathan shook his head slowly. His hand brushed the cover of the Bible on the table. "No," he said. "I've buried too many left behind. I won't make you another." Outside, the dawn broke over the prairie, red light spilling across the gallows where ropes still swayed. The shadow of Silas Cain lingered, a ghost binding them both. Night fell heavy across the prairie, the sky scattered with stars sharp as cold steel. Jonathan sat at the cabin table, the oil lamp burning low, ledger papers spread before him. Mara lay in restless sleep on the mattress, her breaths uneven but steadier than before. For a fleeting hour, silence seemed to hold. Then came the sound, hooves, slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of men certain of their purpose. Jonathan stiffened. He reached instinctively for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Mara stirred, her eyes snapping open, wide with terror. "They're here," she whispered. The hoofbeats grew louder, joined by the creak of leather and the jingle of spurs. Shadows shifted outside the window, horsemen circling the yard. Then a heavy fist slammed against the door. "Jonathan Hale!" a rough voice barked, thick with tobacco and authority born of violence. "We know you're in there, and that freak with you too! Come out now, or we'll burn this shack to ash!" Jonathan steadied his breath, then unlatched the door. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, the chill night air biting his face. 5 riders waited in the moonlight, their horses restless, snorting clouds of breath into the dark. At their head sat a man with a thick beard streaked in gray, eyes glinting like an animal's. He carried himself with the confidence of one who believed the land already belonged to him. Jonathan's voice was steady, even cold. "What do you want?" The bearded man spat to the dirt. "Payment. Silas Kane owed us, and he promised to pay in 2 ways, this land and that beast he kept in his barn. But Kane's gone, so the debt falls to you." Jonathan's grip tightened on the rifle. "I bought this land fair, signed deed from the territorial court. Whatever Kane owed, it's not mine." The gang laughed, a chorus harsh as gravel. Cole leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing. "Paper law don't mean a damn thing out here. Only law that matters is whose gun speaks louder." He let the silence hang before continuing. "You've got 7 days, Hale. 7 days to pay what Kane owed. Fail, and we take this land, and we take her." His finger jabbed toward the cabin, where Mara's shadow lingered in the lamplight. Jonathan's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. "If you think I'll hand her over to you, you're mistaken." Cole's lips curled into a sneer. "Then you'd best dig 2 graves, yours and hers. We'll be back at sundown on the 7th day. If you're still here, you're finished." He yanked the reins. The riders turned as one, their hooves pounding the earth, raising a cloud of red dust that glowed in the moonlight like blood in water. Jonathan stood motionless on the porch, the rifle heavy in his hands. Inside, Mara's breath came quick and shallow. She had heard every word. "You see," she whispered when he returned, "I only bring ruin. They'll kill you because of me." Jonathan set the rifle against the wall, his face hard but resolute. "No," he said quietly, "they'll kill us if we give up. But if we stand—" He looked at her, meeting the storm in her eyes with the steel in his own. "Then we still have a chance." The night dragged long after the hoofbeats faded into the distance. Jonathan sat at the table, oil lamp flickering, hands clasped together as though in prayer, though no words came. The weight of the ultimatum pressed down on him, the shadow of 7 days ticking away before the storm returned. Across the room, Mara sat propped against the wall, her broad frame casting long shadows. The bandage at her throat had darkened with bruising, but her eyes burned with a fear that cut deeper than any wound. "You shouldn't stay," she said finally, her voice raw. "If you keep me here, they'll kill you. You saw their faces. They won't stop." Jonathan raised his head. "If I send you out, they'll finish what Kane started." Mara shook her head, bitter laughter breaking in her throat. "Better me than you. I was never meant to live long. Not here. Not like this. I've been called monster since I was a child. You think that changes just because you spoke my name?" Her words struck like hammer blows. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing, not at her, but at the memory of too many nights on campaign. The cries of the dying, the faces of men he couldn't save, the way war chewed through flesh and soul alike. "I know what it is to watch someone left behind," he said quietly. "I swore I wouldn't let it happen again." His voice faltered, rough with old scars. "Not if I could help it." Mara stared at him, confusion flickering behind the fear.
Why? Why risk yourself for me? I'm nothing to you." Jonathan reached to the table, fingers brushing the worn Bible's cover. The gold letters had long since faded, but his mother's words still lived within. "Do not forsake the least of these." "You're not nothing," he said firmly. "You're alive. That's enough." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by the restless rattle of the wind outside. Mara looked away, jaw clenched, her shoulders shaking as if from a weight too heavy to carry. For a moment, Jonathan thought she might cry, but no tears came, only a long, weary sigh. "You'll regret it," she whispered. "Everyone does." Jonathan stood, crossed the room, and crouched beside her. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, rough from years of battle, but steady as stone. "Listen to me. I've carried wounded men from fields where the earth drank more blood than rain. I've seen monsters, real monsters, in human skin.
You are not one of them." Her storm-gray eyes met his, uncertain, wavering. In that flickering lamplight, for the first time since the rope had cut into her flesh, she didn't look like a creature marked for death. She looked like someone clinging to a chance she didn't dare believe in. Jonathan let his hand fall back, voice steady. 7 days, we face them together. After that, we'll see where the Lord leads us. Mara's lips parted, but no protest followed. Only silence, heavy with a fragile thread of trust. Outside, the prairie wind howled like wolves circling in the dark. But inside, in the dim cabin glow, a promise had been forged. The days that followed blurred into a storm of labor and dust. Each sunrise came blazing, pouring fire across the cracked earth. By mid-morning, Jonathan's shirt clung to his back with sweat, his hands raw from rebuilding the broken fence lines. Beside him, Mara worked with a strength that startled even him. She hauled timbers 2 men together could barely lift, setting them into place with stubborn resolve. When Jonathan dug irrigation ditches, she swung the spade deep into the hard-pan soil, carving furrows that might one day carry wire to seed. She never complained, not once. But in the quiet pauses, he caught glimpses of the pain she carried, her fingers lingering on the bruise at her throat, her gaze fixed on the gallows beam now lying shattered in the dust. At night, they sat by the dim fire. Meals were meager, dry bread, a little salted pork, water drawn from the well. Mara ate slowly, as if not yet convinced she deserved food at all. Jonathan forced a weary smile, sliding the plate closer. "You'll need your strength," he said. She gave no answer, but the faintest flicker of gratitude softened her storm-gray eyes. On the 3rd day, Jonathan saddled his horse and rode to the nearest market town. Mara watched from the porch, arms crossed tight, as if bracing against abandonment. He gave her a single nod before riding out. The town was small, built around a dusty crossroads where wagons groaned and cattle bawled in the pens. Jonathan tied his horse outside the trading post and stepped inside, ledger in hand. The traders knew the name Silas Kane well. Their faces hardened when Jonathan spoke it. An old merchant with a silver beard spat on the floorboards. "Kane cheated us all," he muttered. "Sold the same cattle twice, left debts he never paid. Then he vanished, and now you stand in his boots." Jonathan laid the ledger on the counter, his tone blunt but steady. "I'm not him. I bought the land with my own coin. If you'll give me time, I'll make it right. You'll be paid." For a long moment, silence stretched. Then the old merchant leaned forward, eyes searching Jonathan's face. "You've seen war," he said finally. "I see it in your eyes. All right, 3 months. Bring me what the land yields. Fail, and the ranch is mine." Jonathan left with a tight jaw, the words weighing on him. 3 months. It was a reprieve, but a fragile one. When he returned at sunset, he found Mara bent over the fields, planting seed with deliberate care. The sight struck him. This woman who had been strung up as a monster, now kneeling in the dirt, pressing kernels into the soil, as if each were a prayer. He dismounted, voice low but firm. The town gave us time. Not much, but enough. Mara straightened, dust clinging to her hands and clothes. For the first time, her lips curved into something like a smile. "Then we work," she said simply. And work they did.
Day by day, under the burning sun, beneath the shadow of the seventh day approaching, they labored side by side. The prairie wind carried the scent of sweat, dust, and fragile hope. The sixth night fell heavy with silence, the air thick as if the prairie itself were holding its breath. The chores of the day were done, fences mended, rows of seed pressed into waiting earth, tools set aside with hands too weary to grip them any longer. Jonathan sat on the porch, cleaning the rifle beneath the fading light. Each click of the oiled rag against metal sounded sharp in the stillness. Mara lingered by the fence, staring out across the vast open land as the last of the sun bled into crimson. Then it came, faint, carried on the wind, the soft toll of a bell. From far off, miles away, maybe from a town Jonathan had passed only once, a church bell. Mara froze. The sound drifted over the grasslands, low and solemn, ringing like a memory unearthed. Her broad shoulders shook. She pressed her hands over her face, but the tears forced their way through, streaking down with the dust. "My mother," she whispered, voice cracking. "She used to sing when she heard the bells.
Said the Lord's house was open to all souls, even broken ones." Her breath shuddered, pain and longing mixing into something raw. "I never dared step inside. They'd never let a monster through those doors." Jonathan laid the rifle aside and rose. He crossed the yard slowly, boots crunching against dry soil. Mara kept her gaze down, ashamed of the tears that ran unchecked. "You're not a monster," Jonathan said softly, "and no door the Lord opens can be shut by men." She lifted her eyes to him then, storm gray and brimming with sorrow. For a moment, Jonathan saw the child she must have been once, listening to her mother's hymns, believing in a grace the world denied her. He reached out, rested a hand steady on her shoulder. His touch was awkward, roughened by callus, but it held. "I've seen the worst of men," he said. "They wore uniforms, carried flags, swore they fought for God and country, but their hands were soaked in blood. And I've seen the best of souls, the ones who had nothing, who gave anyway. I'll tell you true, Mara, grace isn't measured in what men call you. It's measured in what you carry through the fire." She bowed her head, shoulders trembling, and let the tears fall freely. Jonathan stood beside her in silence, the two of them listening as the bell tolled, faint and steady, fading into the night wind. When at last the sound was gone, Jonathan returned to the porch. He sat, pulled the tattered Bible from his coat, and opened it across his knees. The lamplight flickered over the thin pages. His lips moved in a prayer spoken only to the night. "Lord, I've carried burdens I thought would break me. Tomorrow I may carry more, but give me strength to stand, not for myself, but for the soul you set in my path." The wind rustled the dry grass, the prairie sighing like an old hymn. Inside the cabin, Mara lay down at last, her tears spent, her breathing slow but steady. Jonathan closed the Bible, his eyes on the horizon where darkness gathered thick. The seventh day was coming, and with it, the riders. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The seventh day bled into dusk, the sky awash with fire and shadow. The prairie held its breath. Even the cicadas stilled, as if they too sensed what was coming. Jonathan stood at the broken gate, Winchester cradled in his arms. The wood creaked beneath his boots, old boards groaning like the land itself. Behind him, the cabin windows glowed faint with lamplight. Inside lay everything he had left, ledger, Bible, and the fragile hope that had kept him moving through 7 long days.
Beside him, Mara loomed like a living shadow, her broad shoulders squared, though her hands trembled at her sides. The bruises at her throat had faded to dark welts, but the memory of the noose lingered in her eyes. She stared at the horizon, where the sun dipped low, and whispered, "They're coming." And then the dust rose. Far out on the road, a cloud unfurled, crimson in the dying light. The thunder of hooves rolled closer, steady and merciless, shaking the ground beneath them. Jonathan's grip tightened on the rifle stock, his breath calm, steady, just as it had been on battlefields where hesitation meant death. Through the haze they appeared. 15 riders, silhouettes etched against the blood-red sky, rifles glinting, lanterns swaying from saddle horns. At their head rode Rufus Cole, his thick beard catching the last of the sunlight, his eyes cold and certain. The gang reined in before the gate, their horses restless, snorting clouds of dust into the twilight. Cole leaned forward in his saddle, lips curling into a sneer. "Well, look here," he called, his voice carrion sharp and cruel. "The old soldier and his pet freak. Thought you might 'a' run by now." Jonathan said nothing. He planted his boots firm, rifle steady across his chest. Mara shifted beside him, her storm-gray eyes narrowing, fear and defiance warring in their depths. Cole laughed, the sound harsh as a rusted blade. "You really mean to stand against 15 armed men? An old war ghost and a half-dead giant? Out here, Hale, law don't sit in courts, it sits in the barrel of a gun." The last light of the sun caught Jonathan's face, carving hard lines across his features. He lifted his voice, calm and cold. "This land is mine, bought with my own coin. You'll take it over my body." The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Mara's breath came quick at his side, but she stood taller, as though his defiance steadied her spine. Cole's grin widened, cruel and certain. He raised a hand, fingers curling into a fist. Behind him, rifles shifted, saddles creaked. The riders leaned forward like wolves scenting blood. The prairie wind stirred, sweeping dust across the yard, rattling the broken fence. Jonathan lowered the Winchester into his hands, his finger brushing the trigger. Mara's chest rose, steadying, her hands curling into fists. The sun vanished, night fell, and with it the first spark of war. The silence cracked. Cole's sneer twisted into a bark of laughter. "Go on, Hale, let's see if you can still shoot straight, or will you let the freak swing for you this time?" Jonathan did not answer. His eyes narrowed, breath steady, body still as stone. The years of drill and battle returned with chilling ease. The way to line a shot, the way to exhale just before pulling the trigger. Cole jerked his hand down. The first rider spurred forward, rifle rising. Jonathan's Winchester barked. The bullet struck the dirt inches from the man's horse, exploding dust into the air. The animal reared, screaming. The rider toppled, his weapon clattering away. Gunfire erupted in reply. Muzzles flashed, thunder rolling across the yard. Bullets snapped through the night air, splintering fence posts, punching holes into the cabin's timbers. Mara ducked low, the wind of lead whipping past her face. Jonathan fired again and again, each shot measured, deliberate. A rider fell clutching his arm, another's hat snapped clean off his head. Jonathan moved with the grim calm of a man who had long ago made peace with the noise of war. But even as his rifle cracked, the odds pressed heavy. 15 riders, too many guns, too many angles. Mara's breath came ragged. Her eyes darted to the gallows, the weathered frame where ropes still swung. The memory of the noose tightened around her throat, but so too did a surge of defiance. With a roar, she charged forward. The riders laughed at first until she seized the beam.
Her great hands gripped the rotting wood, and with a guttural cry she wrenched it free from the earth. Nails screeched loose, timbers groaned. Then the gallows came down in her hands, a massive post, now a weapon. The laughter died. Mara swung. The beam crashed through the air with the force of a battering ram, scattering 2 riders as their horses bolted in terror. Dust and splinters exploded around her. The symbol of her execution turned into a weapon of survival. Jonathan caught the sight from the corner of his eye. For a heartbeat, he almost forgot the rifle in his grip. The woman he had cut down days ago now stood like a storm incarnate, her roar shaking the night. Cole snarled, raising his revolver. "Shoot the beast!" Bullets whined past Mara. One grazed her shoulder, another tore through her sleeve. She staggered, teeth gritted, then hefted the beam again. The earth shuddered as she brought it down, shattering a fence rail, scattering riders like frightened cattle. Jonathan reloaded, chamber clicking sharp. His voice cut through the chaos, firm as command. "Hold the line, Mara!" And side by side, under a sky gone black and a yard lit with fire, the soldier and the outcast made their stand. The ranch yard erupted into hell. Gunfire cracked like lightning, deafening in its fury. Sparks spat from iron barrels, smoke rolling thick and acrid through the air. Horses screamed, rearing high, their hooves pounding the dirt like war drums. Jonathan dropped to one knee, rifle steady. His shots were measured, never wasted, each squeeze of the trigger deliberate, each bullet finding its mark. A rider pitched backward off his saddle, another's rifle shattered in his grip. The training of years on battlefields returned like muscle memory. Fire, breathe, reload, fire again. He moved with ruthless economy, shell casings scattering around his boots, eyes cold as stone. This was no longer a rancher defending land. This was a soldier, carved from war, answering fire with fire. Across the yard, Mara roared. The sound tore through the chaos, primal and fierce, echoing off the cabin walls. She swung the beam of the gallows wide, the massive timber smashing through a horse's flank, sending beast and rider tumbling into dust. Another lunged at her with a rope. She seized it mid-air, yanked the man from his saddle, and flung him across the yard like a sack of grain. "Hold the line!" Jonathan shouted, his voice carrying over the storm. She answered with another roar, her strength a wall of defiance. 2 men tried to flank her, pistols blazing. She tore a rail from the broken fence and hurled it, splintering against one rider's chest, knocking him to the ground. Bullets tore through the night, snapping wood, sparking stone. One grazed Jonathan's arm, searing pain across his skin, but he didn't falter. He reloaded, chamber clicking sharp, and fired again. Another rider fell, clutching his side. The yard was a storm of red dust and smoke. Mara's massive frame towered through it, lit by muzzle flashes, swinging the gallows beam in brutal arcs. Men screamed, horses bucked, chaos rippled like wildfire. Cole bellowed from the rear, revolver blazing, "Cut them down! Kill them both!" His eyes burned with fury, but beneath it was something else, doubt. He had expected a slaughter, not resistance that shook his gang to its core. Jonathan's breath came hard, sweat stinging his eyes. Yet his aim held true, each shot steady as heartbeat. He fought not with rage, but with grim resolve, the kind forged in trenches and fields soaked in blood. Mara pressed forward, unstoppable. A rope snared her arm, 2 riders pulling hard. With a guttural cry she wrenched free, dragging both men from their saddles, slamming them into the dirt. Her eyes blazed, her chest heaved, but she did not falter. For every man that fell, dust and smoke swallowed another. The ranch was no longer land. It was a battlefield, a crucible of fire and grit. And in the heart of it, side by side, stood the soldier and the giant. The yard burned with chaos, dust rising, smoke choking the air. The ground churned to mud and blood. Jonathan braced against the fence, his rifle snapping with sharp, measured fire. Each pull of the trigger sent another rider crashing down. Then the bullet came. It grazed across his ribs, white-hot pain searing through his side. Jonathan staggered, breath torn from his lungs. He dropped to one knee, clutching the wound, vision blurring. The Winchester nearly slipped from his grip. "Jonathan!" Mara's voice tore through the storm. Her cry drew the rider's eyes. Two of Cole's men spurred forward, ropes spinning in the air. The lassos snapped tight around Mara's arms, jerking her back with brutal force. She roared, thrashing, dragging the horses in circles. But the men pulled harder, ropes biting into her skin. Another loop caught her chest, pinning her. The beam she wielded slipped from her grasp, crashing into the dirt. Dust swallowed her as she stumbled, bound like a wild beast. Cole laughed, his voice carrying above the storm.
"There it is, the monster, tamed at last." The ropes cut deep. Mara's knees hit the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The memory of the noose closed in again, the suffocating burn at her throat, the cruel jeers of men watching her hang. She saw the gallows beam lying shattered nearby, the same beam that had once promised her death. And something inside her broke. With a guttural cry, she surged upward. Muscles coiled, tendons screamed. The rope strained, groaned, and then snapped with sharp cracks. The horses reared, throwing their riders as Mara wrenched free, fury blazing in her storm-gray eyes. She seized the trailing ropes, yanked the men from the dirt, and flung them aside like rag dolls. The gang fell back in shock, their laughter gone, replaced with a sudden fear. Mara's gaze locked on the gallows beam, lying splintered in the dust. Slowly, she bent, gripped the timber once more, and with a roar, lifted it high. Then she swung. The beam smashed into the gallows frame, still half standing at the yard's edge. Wood splintered, nails shrieked, and the execution scaffold collapsed in a spray of dust and shards. The symbol of her death, the mark of her humiliation, was obliterated in one strike. The riders faltered. Even Jonathan, pressing his hand to his bleeding side, stared in stunned silence. Mara stood tall, chest heaving, dust and blood streaking her skin, but her eyes burned with something fierce and new: freedom. The wind carried the echo of splintered wood like a hymn, a declaration. No rope would claim her again. Jonathan gritted his teeth, lifted his rifle once more, and shouted hoarsely, "Stand with her or fall with Cain's lies!" The tide turned. Half the gang wavered, glancing at their fallen comrades, at the wreckage of the gallows, at the giantess who refused to bow. The fear was spreading now, not from Cole's threats, but from the unbreakable will standing against him. And for the first time, Rufus Cole's sneer faltered. The dust began to settle, gunfire dwindling into silence. Smoke curled through the broken fence, the yard littered with bodies, wounded horses limping into the night. Only a handful of Cole's riders remained, their courage shattered, their eyes fixed on the towering figure that strode through the haze. Mara. She moved like a force of nature, the shattered beam of the gallows still clutched in one hand, blood streaking her arm where bullets had grazed her. Her breath came ragged, but her stride was steady, relentless. And at the far edge of the yard, scrambling behind a toppled saddle, was Rufus Cole. His revolver shook in his grip, the sneer gone, replaced with naked fear. "Stay back!" he barked, but his voice cracked thin. Mara dropped the beam and lunged. Her massive hand seized Cole by the collar, yanking him from the dirt. His revolver fell uselessly into the dust. She lifted him high, his boots dangling, his legs kicking helplessly. "You called me monster," she growled, her voice shaking with years of pain. "You strung me up like an animal. How does it feel now?" Cole choked, clawing at her grip, eyes bulging. Around them, the remaining riders sat frozen, unwilling to move, unwilling to interfere. Jonathan staggered forward, blood seeping through his shirt where the bullet had torn flesh. Every step jarred pain through his side, but he pressed on, his rifle dragging at his hand until it slipped from his grip. "Mara!" he rasped, his voice rough but steady. "Don't!" She turned, eyes blazing, tears streaking through the dust on her face. "He deserves it. Every breath he's stolen, every name he spat, every drop of blood he spilled, he deserves it." Jonathan stopped a few paces away, swaying on his feet. He met her eyes, storm to storm, and shook his head. "Maybe he does, but if you kill him, you carry his chains forever. You'll be the monster he said you were." Her knuckles whitened around Cole's shirt. He wheezed, his face purple. Jonathan took another step, his voice breaking but firm. "I've seen enough death, Mara, too much. War taught me how easy it is to kill, but faith," his hand pressed to the Bible tucked in his coat, "faith taught me how hard it is to spare. Let him go. Show him we are more than what he made us." Mara's chest heaved. For a heartbeat, the yard held still. The gang, the horses, even the wind seemed to wait. Her eyes glistened, fury and sorrow tangled in one. Then, with a roar that shook her to the core, she flung Cole to the ground. He hit the dirt hard, coughing, gasping, scrambling backward on hands and knees. Jonathan raised his voice, iron in his tone, despite the blood on his lips. "Run, Cole. Run and tell the world, this land will not bow to your rope, nor your lies. If you come back, it will be your grave." Cole scrambled to his horse, terror in his eyes, and fled into the night. The scattered riders followed, galloping into the darkness, their dust trailing like a shroud. Mara stood trembling, her huge hands shaking, tears running freely now. Jonathan sank to one knee, chest heaving, and for the first time the yard was silent. Silence. The ranch yard, once a storm of fire and fury, now lay smothered under a blanket of red dust. Smoke curled from shattered timbers, the acrid stench of gunpowder lingering heavy in the air. A broken fence post groaned in the wind, and somewhere in the distance a horse screamed before bolting into the night. Jonathan stood swaying, one hand pressed hard to his bleeding side. The Winchester dangled useless from his other hand before he let it fall into the dirt. His chest rose and fell in ragged gasps, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon where Cole and his men had vanished. "They're gone," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "By God's hand, they're gone." His knees buckled, and he sank into the dust. He bowed his head, lips moving in a prayer too quiet for any but the Lord to hear. "Thank you for giving us breath yet, for sparing what I could not." His bloodied fingers traced the worn cover of the Bible tucked against his chest, and for the first time in years the words did not feel like hollow ritual, but like lifeblood itself. Across the yard, Mara stood trembling. The rope still dangled from her arms, torn and frayed, but her hands shook as if the memory of them burned deeper than the wounds. She stared at the ruins of the gallows, now a heap of shattered wood and dust. Her chest hitched, and she sank to her knees. Her huge frame curled inward, her hands clutching her face. The tears came heavy, unashamed, cutting clean lines through the dirt on her cheeks. "I'm alive," she whispered, as if tasting the words for the first time. "I'm alive." Jonathan dragged himself across the dust until he reached her side. He laid a hand on her arm, steady despite the tremor in his body. "You are more than alive, Mara," he said, voice rough but sure. "You're free."
No rope, no man, no lie can bind you now." She looked at him, storm-gray eyes red with tears, and for once they did not hold fear or rage. They held something softer, uncertain, fragile, but real. The prairie wind swept across them, carrying away the last wisps of smoke. The ranch yard bore scars now, splintered beams, bloodied earth. But within the wreckage stood two souls who had refused to break. Jonathan lifted his gaze skyward, the stars burning clear above the dust. Pain throbbed in every muscle, but his lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. He spoke low, not to Mara, but to the heavens. "We are still here." And Mara, wiping her tears with unsteady hands, echoed him in a voice cracked but unyielding, "Still here." Together they sat in the dust, battle-worn and blood-stained, bound not by chains but by survival, and by a promise that from this night on, neither would stand alone again. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. Morning came slow, pale light spilling over a ranch yard scarred by battle.
The dust had settled, leaving behind broken beams, shattered fences, and dark stains in the soil where the earth had drunk deep of blood. Vultures circled overhead, silent witnesses to what the night had taken. Jonathan rose stiffly from the porch where he had collapsed before dawn. His side burned where the bullet had grazed him, but the bleeding had slowed, wrapped in bandages Mara had bound with rough, gentle hands. He pressed a palm against the wound and breathed deep, tasting smoke and iron still clinging to the air. Mara moved across the yard in silence. Her broad frame bent low as she dragged fallen timbers into piles, her shoulders straining with effort. The ropes that had bound her still lay coiled in the dust. Each time her eyes passed over them, her jaw tightened, but she carried on, step by step. By noon, the worst of the wreckage was cleared. Together they dug shallow graves at the edge of the field. Jonathan's hands blistered on the spade, Mara's strength carrying what his body could not. They worked without words, the silence filled only by the scrape of shovels and the sighing prairie wind.
When at last the mounds of earth were smoothed over, Jonathan stood hat in hand, lips moving in quiet prayer. Mara bowed her head, her storm-gray eyes heavy, but for the first time she did not look away from the act of grace. When the work was done, Jonathan led her back inside the cabin. The air within still smelled of oil and smoke, but it was shelter. He pulled a small ledger from the table, its pages worn and ink-stained, left behind by Silas Kane. Mara's eyes darkened at the sight. "That book," she whispered, her voice raw. "It's chains, all his lies, all his debts. He made me pay with my blood." Jonathan flipped the pages slowly, his face carved in hard lines. A mountain of numbers, enough to drown a man. He borrowed against cattle he never owned, against crops never planted, and when the walls closed in, he threw you to the wolves. His hand tightened on the book until his knuckles whitened. Mara reached for it, as though to tear it apart. But Jonathan set his hand over hers, steady, firm. "No," he said softly, "we won't fight these debts with blood. We'll pay them back with work, with sweat, with the land itself." Her gaze met his, uncertain, searching.
"You'd bind yourself to my chains?" Jonathan gave a tired, rough laugh. "They're not your chains anymore. If I bought this land, I bought its weight too. But I won't carry it alone. Not now." The words hung in the still air. Mara's lips trembled, her broad shoulders shaking as though she bore the weight of more than wood and soil. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Then we work," she said. Her voice was low but steady. Jonathan closed the ledger with a firm slap and set it on the table. He looked around the battered cabin, the cracked walls, the broken fence visible through the window. Wreckage everywhere. And yet, in that moment, he felt the faint stirring of something he had not known in years: hope.
Mara sat across from him, her great hands folded in her lap. For once, she did not look like the woman who had hung from a noose, nor the monster Cain had painted her to be. She looked like a partner, a soul as battered as his, but still standing. Outside, the prairie wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of tilled earth and fresh-turned graves. The land had seen blood, but it would see life again. Jonathan reached for his coffee tin, poured 2 cups, and set one before Mara.
She hesitated, then took it, her massive hand dwarfing the tin. They drank in silence, but no words were needed. For the first time, the ranch felt less like a battlefield and more like a beginning. 3 months passed. The prairie winds still howled, carrying red dust across the land. But the ranch no longer lay broken. Fences stood straight, rails solid beneath Mara's tireless hands. Rows of corn stretched green across the fields, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Cattle lowed from rebuilt pens. Water trickled steady through the irrigation ditches Jonathan had carved with sweat and grit. Each morning, Jonathan rose before dawn. He rode to town with sacks of corn or sides of beef, his back straight, his word firm. The traders, men once cheated by Cain, listened when Jonathan spoke, for he did not bargain with slick words, but with honesty. "I'll pay every cent," he told them, "but with fair work, not with blood." And slowly, coin by coin, the mountain of debt began to shrink. Mara worked the land with him, her strength carrying what no beast or machine could. She mended fences, hauled water, stood guard at night when coyotes prowled too close. But it wasn't only her strength that carried the ranch forward. She planted flowers by the cabin door, patched Jonathan's torn shirts with clumsy stitches, and once, when he returned from town, she handed him a wild bouquet of prairie blooms. He stared at her, startled, until she laughed, a laugh clear and childlike, as if no one had ever dared call her monster. In town, whispers followed them still. Some folks crossed the street when Mara walked by, their eyes wary. But others began to nod, tipping hats, their glances holding something new, respect. The woman who had been strung up to die now carried herself with quiet dignity, her shadow long but no longer dark. One evening, as the sun burned low and gold across the horizon, Jonathan rode back from town. His pockets carried only a small pouch of coins, but his heart carried something greater. He found Mara in the cornfield, her broad figure bent over the rows. She turned when she saw him, her face flushed in the fading light, holding up a bundle of freshly picked ears. "They grew," she said, her voice trembling with pride. Jonathan laughed aloud, the sound rough and unexpected, as though torn free from years of silence. He swung down from his horse, took the corn from her hands, and for a moment simply looked at her. Not as a debt, not as a burden, but as the reason this place lived again. That night, they sat on the porch, 2 tin cups of coffee between them. The crickets sang, the prairie wind softened, carrying the scent of young corn instead of smoke and blood. Jonathan's voice came low, steady. "3 months ago, I thought I bought a trap, but I found a home." Mara froze, her storm-gray eyes wide. Slowly, tears filled them, not of sorrow, but of something long denied. She set her great hand over his, dwarfing it, and whispered, "You believed in me when no one else did. I will never forget that." They sat in silence then, side by side, no more words needed. Only the wind, the quiet, and the fragile warmth between 2 souls once left for dead. At dawn, smoke rose from the cabin chimney, a declaration that the place had come back to life. Mara laughed as calves chased one another in the yard, her joy ringing louder than every cruel name once thrown at her. Jonathan watched her, coffee steaming in his hand, and thought back to the night he first arrived, when she hung half dead from a rope. One choice had changed everything. Cutting that rope had not only saved a life, it had saved his own. The ledger still lay half full, debts not yet gone.
But Jonathan believed now, with a conviction deeper than war or loss, that together they would endure. The noose was gone. In its place stood a bond, scarred, imperfect, but stronger than rope, stronger than fear. And on the wide, endless prairie, under the hand of God, that was enough. Out on the frontier, life was never simple. Every fence mended, every seed planted, every night survived under a sky full of stars carried the weight of sacrifice. Jonathan and Mara's story is not just about land or blood, but about how grace can break chains, how hope can be born from dust. Many of you who listen may carry scars of your own, loss, betrayal, or the loneliness of long roads behind you. Perhaps you, too, remember a time when one small act of kindness changed everything. That is why we tell these true Wild West stories. Not to glorify the dust and the guns, but to honor the hearts that endured, the faith that held fast, and the bonds that turned nooses into lifelines.
If this story stirred something in you, share it, leave your thoughts below, and subscribe so together we keep these memories alive.